Hi, and welcome back to Perspectives. I'm Ellie Ballard, and today we tackle police use of force. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a couple of statistics that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this presentation together. First, police use force in fewer than 20% of all adult custodial arrests. Second, over half of use of force incidents involve merely grabbing and holding the suspect.
So what is use of force? Use of force is the physical restraint by a police officer when dealing with a member of the public. Police are authorized to use the amount of force that's reasonable and necessary to gain compliance from a suspect. Generally, the level of force used by the police is relative to the suspect's resistance. Force may include threatening, restraining, handcuffing, hitting or punching, choking, striking with a baton, flashlight, chemical force, or use of a taser or gun. The use of force continuum was introduced in the 1980s and was the primary model guiding officers' decisions about the level of force to use in various situations. It served as a guide to help officers apply an appropriate amount of force depending on the level of resistance they encountered. It generally followed a step-like process. The use of force continuum outlines the escalating and de-escalating levels of force police may use depending on the situation and the level of threat or resistance they encounter. While specific models may vary between agency, the common levels of force include officer presence. The mere presence of a uniformed officer can act as a deterrent and establish control without any physical or verbal action. Verbal commands. Clear and firm verbal instructions are given to gain compliance, such as stop, let me see your hands, or you're under arrest. Empty hands or soft techniques. Officers may use physical restraint techniques like holding, grabbing, joint locks, or OC, that's pepper spray, to control a suspect without causing significant injury. Hard techniques. When soft techniques are ineffective, officers may use punches, kicks, or takedowns to subdue a resistant suspect. This may involve the use of non-lethal weapons such as tasers or batons that are intended to incapacitate or control the suspect without causing fatal injury. Lethal force. The highest level of force, lethal force, involves using firearms, or other deadly weapons when an officer reasonably believes that the suspect poses an immediate threat of serious harm or death to the officer or to others. The use of force should be proportional to the threat encountered. A couple of points that need to be noted. Officers are not required to follow the levels of the use of force continuum in a strict linear order. Instead, they can begin, escalate, or de-escalate to any level of force based on the demands of the situation. This means officers may jump from one level to another, whether it's starting at a higher level of force or quickly reducing it, depending on the level of threat or resistance they encounter. This clarifies that the continuum is flexible and adaptive to the dynamic circumstances rather than a rigid step-by-step process. While the continuum was meant to offer a framework for progressive use of force, criticism arose over its rigid, step-like structure, which didn't always translate or manifest in dynamic real-world situations that required officers to move quickly between levels of force. Police use of force training has evolved significantly since the introduction of the use of force continuum, which was once the primary model guiding officers' decisions about the level of force to use in various situations. This evolution reflects a growing emphasis on de-escalation, accountability, community relations, and the use of new technologies. There has been a significant shift in this philosophy. Modern training has shifted away from simply following the use of force continuum to prioritizing de-escalation techniques. This shift focuses on minimizing the need for force through conflict resolution and communication strategies. De-escalation is the process of reducing the intensity of a conflict or volatile situation, often using communication and behavioral techniques. The goal is to calm individuals involved and prevent escalation into more harmful actions. De-escalation is now commonly taught through scenario-based simulations, which officers practice in de-escalating tense situations through negotiation, patience, and understanding instead of immediately using physical or deadly force. Training now incorporates empathy, cultural competency, and active listening skills as ways to reduce the likelihood of confrontations turning violent. Many police agencies have moved away from the rigid continuum model, emphasizing instead the concept of proportionality, that force should be used when necessary and should be proportional to the threat encountered. Departments are training officers on using only force that is both reasonable and necessary given the circumstances, with a focus on minimal force rather than moving through specific stages of a continuum. Relatedly, and just as important, increasingly, police training includes the duty to intervene, requiring officers to stop excessive use of force by colleagues and report misconduct. All of this is reflective of a shift in philosophy that emphasizes the preservation of life, urging officers to prioritize the safety of everyone involved, including suspects, bystanders, and officers. This philosophy encourages officers to use tactics like tactical retreat. This is creating distance or taking cover, rather than immediately escalating to force. This creates time and distance. The idea that officers should slow down interactions, create distance, and use cover when possible is emphasized. This gives officers more time to assess situations, call for backup, or use less than lethal options instead of making hasty decisions that lead to force. Many of these new practices reflect major legal and policy reforms such as banning or restricting the use of chokeholds and neck restraints, the elimination of use of no-knock warrants, the requirement of specialized training in de-escalation, crisis intervention training, and cultural sensitivity and implicit bias training. Advanced scenario-based training using role-playing and even virtual reality allows officers to practice handling real-life situations under stress. These exercises often replicate situations where use of force may be necessary, but challenge officers to use de-escalation tactics before resorting to physical or lethal force. Virtual reality training platforms are becoming more widespread, and this allows officers to interact in highly realistic, simulated environments to practice decision-making in rapidly evolving situations. These simulations focus not only on tactical response, but also on emotional control and judgment under stress. Officers also now receive crisis intervention training, designed to help them safely and effectively interact with individuals experiencing mental health crises. This training emphasizes calming techniques, nonviolent intervention, and partnerships with mental health professionals. Some agencies have also adopted collaborative models where mental health specialists or crisis teams work alongside police officers to reduce the reliance on force when handling vulnerable populations. Officers now undergo training that includes cultural competency to better understand and communicate with the diverse communities that they serve. This training helps officers avoid unnecessary confrontations based on misunderstandings. Recent use of force training programs also incorporate implicit bias training to help officers recognize and mitigate subconscious biases that may influence their use of force, particularly against marginalized communities. High profiles of police violence, especially involving unarmed Black individuals, have led to increased public pressure for transparency and reform. This scrutiny, in conjunction with evolving philosophies, has led to legislative reforms, new training mandates, and policy changes designed to reduce unnecessary use of force and increase police accountability. Some states are creating or strengthening mechanisms to decertify officers for repeated use of force violations. Federal oversight has also been applied through consent decrees in cities with a history of police misconduct. Let's talk about what constitutes excessive force and differentiate it from illegal use of force. Excessive force is the use or frequency of force that is greater than necessary to compel compliance from a suspect. Here are a few examples. An officer shoves and strikes a suspect when grabbing and holding the suspect would have gained the suspect's compliance. During an arrest, an officer repeatedly strikes a suspect who is lying on the ground and who has stopped resisting. A compliant but, let's say, chatty suspect is pepper sprayed after following the officer's instructions, simply because they were, well, verbally expressing frustration at maybe a particularly loud volume. An officer applies a chokehold on a suspect who's not physically resisting and poses no immediate threat. Illegal use of force, on the other hand, is force that violates a law or statute. Let's look at a couple more examples. An officer uses a banned chokehold during an arrest, violating departmental policy and local law prohibiting such tactics. An officer shoots at a fleeing, unarmed suspect who poses no imminent threat, violating laws governing the use of deadly force. An officer uses excessive force during an arrest that leads to serious injury, resulting in criminal charges for assault. The suspect is beaten by officers after being restrained and placed in handcuffs, which violates laws against excessive physical punishment of detained individuals. To summarize, excessive force goes beyond what's needed for compliance, while illegal use of force crosses legal boundaries and may lead to criminal liability. What is deadly force, and when and in what circumstances can it be used? Deadly or lethal force is the level of force used by law enforcement that has a high probability of causing death or serious bodily harm. To understand when and what circumstances it can be used in, I need to give you some background. First, let's start at the fleeing felon rule. The fleeing felon rule was a legal doctrine that allowed police officers to use deadly force to stop a fleeing suspect if they believed the suspect had committed a felony. This rule was widely accepted until 1985, when the Supreme Court limited its scope in Tennessee v. Gardner. In 1974, Memphis police officers were dispatched to a suspected burglary. Upon arrival, Officer Hyman saw Edward Gardner, a 15-year-old, fleeing the scene. Gardner, who was unarmed, began climbing a fence to escape. Despite knowing that Gardner did not appear to be armed or pose a threat, Officer Hyman shot him in the back of the head to prevent his escape. This was permitted by Tennessee law at the time, which allowed the use of deadly force against fleeing felons. Gardner died from the gunshot. Gardner's father sued, arguing that the use of deadly force to stop an unarmed, non-violent fleeing suspect was unconstitutional. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court ruled that officers can only use deadly force against a fleeing suspect if they have probable cause to believe the suspect poses an immediate threat of serious harm or death to the officer or to others. This decision prioritized the protection of human life and curtailed the use of deadly force in non-violent situations. Now, Tennessee v. Gardner remains the law of the land until Graham v. Connor, which establishes the objective reasonableness standard. The incident that led to Graham v. Connor began when D. Thorne Graham, a diabetic man, experienced the onset of low blood sugar. He rushed to a convenience store to buy orange juice. After entering and quickly leaving the store without purchasing anything due to a long line, he was driven away by a friend. Officer Connor observed Graham's rapid entry and exit from the store and suspected him of wrongdoing. He initiated a traffic stop. Despite Graham's attempts to explain his medical condition, the officer detained him and called for backup. During the stop, Graham was handcuffed, physically restrained, and sustained injuries, even though he had committed no crime. Graham sued, claiming that the police used excessive force in violation of his Fourth Amendment rights. The Supreme Court ruled in Graham v. Connor that claims of excessive force must be analyzed under the objective reasonableness standard of the Fourth Amendment, meaning that the reasonableness of an officer's actions should be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, not with hindsight. This case established a key precedent for assessing all use of force incidents. When applied specifically to deadly force, Graham v. Connor means that courts assess whether a reasonable officer facing the situation would have believed that deadly force was necessary to prevent imminent serious harm or death. The analysis takes into account factors such as the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the officer or to others, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. In deadly force situation, the decision must be made in tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving conditions. So the officer's actions are evaluated based on what they reasonably knew at the time, not based on the actual outcome or later discoveries. This objective reasonableness standard is central in determining if deadly force was legally justified. The federal deadly force policy governs when federal law enforcement officers are authorized to use deadly force. The key principles of the policy are derived from constitutional standards that align closely with the rules set forth in Tennessee v. Gardner and Graham v. Connor. The policy is intended to limit the use of deadly force to situations where it is absolutely necessary to protect life. The key elements of the federal deadly force policy include: first, imminent threat of death or serious injury. Federal law enforcement officers may use deadly force only when they have a reasonable belief that the suspect poses imminent threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or to others. Preventing escape. So deadly force may be used to prevent escape of a fleeing suspect if the officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect has committed a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical harm, and there is an imminent threat to public safety if the suspect is not apprehended. Verbal warnings. Officers should issue verbal warnings, if feasible, before using deadly force, such as shouting "stop" or identifying themselves as law enforcement. This gives the suspect an opportunity to comply. Necessity and proportionality. Deadly force must be the last resort, meaning that it should only be used when no other reasonable alternatives such as de-escalation or non-lethal force are available to protect life. Prohibited uses of deadly force. Officers cannot use deadly force for reasons other than immediate protection from a serious threat. For instance, deadly force cannot be used to stop a fleeing suspect for a minor crime to prevent property theft or for non-life-threatening situations. In creation of their own policies, most states have adapted some version of the federal deadly force policy. In Georgia, the Official Code of Georgia, Title 17, Criminal Procedure Section 17-4-20 states law enforcement officers can use deadly force to apprehend a suspected felon if they reasonably believe the suspect has a deadly weapon or something that could cause serious bodily injury. They reasonably believe the suspect poses an immediate threat of physical violence. They have probable cause to believe the suspect committed a crime that involved serious physical harm. Now, when deadly force is not permitted in Georgia, it should not be used solely to prevent a suspect from escaping. Firearms should not be discharged at moving vehicles unless someone in the vehicle is threatening the officer or another person with deadly force, that the vehicle is being operated in a way that threatens to cause physical injury or death. Now, the officers cannot shoot to disable the car. They must shoot at the suspect. The Georgia Department of Public Safety also has a use of force report that must be submitted when an officer uses deadly force. It is estimated that between 10% and 36% of police shootings are suicide by cop. According to the National Institutes of Health, suicide by cop is a term used by law enforcement officers to describe an incident in which a suicidal individual intentionally engages in life-threatening and criminal behavior with a lethal weapon or what appears to be a lethal weapon towards law enforcement officers or civilians to specifically provoke officers to shoot the suicidal individual in self-defense or to protect civilians. Not only is this devastating to family members of the deceased individual, officers involved in these incidents don't fare very well. They often experience psychological trauma leading to depression, PTSD, alcohol abuse, and family and work disruptions. The use of less than lethal force in policing gained traction in the mid-20th century, largely in response to public backlash against excessive use of deadly force. Early developments included things like rubber bullets and tear gas for crowd control. Over time, technology evolved to introduce more advanced tools like tasers and other non-lethal devices. This shift reflected changing attitudes towards use of force, with an emphasis on balancing law enforcement effectiveness with the protection of human rights. Today, law enforcement agencies use less than lethal weapons to de-escalate situations while minimizing harm to both officers and suspects. The goal is to provide alternatives to deadly force, especially in scenarios where the use of lethal force may not be justified. Less than lethal weapons allow officers to control dangerous individuals, maintain public safety, and manage large crowds during protests or riots with reduced risks of fatal outcomes. Less than lethal force has the potential to improve outcomes in suicide by cop, but its success is not universal. That is, the use of less than lethal force in suicide by cop incidents has had mixed outcomes. In many cases, less than lethal options have helped law enforcement officers de-escalate situations and avoid the need to use deadly force, potentially saving lives. However, success largely depends on the specifics of each incident, the type of less than lethal weapon used, and the ability of officers to assess and respond appropriately under high-pressure conditions. In some suicide by cop situations, less than lethal tools like tasers, beanbag rounds, or pepper spray have allowed officers to subdue individuals without resorting to fatal means. These options can provide a window of time for mental health intervention and negotiation, offering the individual a chance to survive the crisis. In other cases, less than lethal force may not be effective, especially if the person is armed with a firearm or poses an immediate threat to others. Individuals intent on provoking a deadly response may continue to escalate behavior even after less than lethal force is used, forcing officers to ultimately resort to lethal measures. There have also been instances where less than lethal tools failed to incapacitate the individual adequately, leading to tragic outcomes. Of course, proper training alongside crisis intervention techniques can improve the likelihood of successful outcomes. When officers are trained to recognize mental health crises and deploy less than lethal force options in appropriate situations, the chances of preventing death and suicide by cop incidents increases. However, these tools are not a guaranteed solution, and their effectiveness depends on the context and the behavior of the individual involved.
Okay, we've reached the end once again. Thanks for joining me, and as always, please reach out to me if you have any questions.